Hey, this is Russell Moore, and this is Reading in Exile, where while we're on shutdown around most parts of the world, I'm going through my library and talking about books, and a lot of them are things that you all are asking about. And so somebody asked if I could talk about Neil Gaiman. I've written about Gaiman before. There's an article, I can link to it somewhere if you're interested in it. But when you thinking about Neil Gaiman, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he pretty much sums up popular culture across media right now. And I say that meaning that you can look at, I've got just in front of me right now, collection of Norse mythology, nonfiction essays and literary criticism, novels. There are children's books. There are movies. Some of you have seen the movie Coraline that he's written. Short stories here, graphic novels like the Sandman series and other things that he has done. He had a viral commencement speech called Make Good Art that became a small book that's really good. There aren't a lot of good commencement speeches. As a matter of fact, I can think of maybe two that have ever been put in book form that I would say are good and memorable, and his was one of them. So somebody asked about Gaiman, and so the thing that I want to talk about today is the way that Gaiman talks about Narnia. Okay, we talked about Lewis earlier. Gaiman is not a believer, but he is somebody who sort of fell in love with books and reading and imagination by reading the Chronicles of Narnia. And he writes in this, The View from the Cheap Seats, about how upset he was when he found out that Lewis was a Christian and that there were Christian themes all around The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and The Last Battle particularly, and how he felt like he had discovered that Lewis had a hidden agenda. When I read that the first time, I thought, that's really interesting to me because I had the opposite experience. What drew me to Lewis in reading Mere Christianity was the fact that he didn't have a hidden agenda. I had seen hidden agendas all over the place, and Lewis seemed to be straightforward with his. But he felt as though it was hidden. And so he had kind of a reaction to it that shows up sometimes. He's written some, in my view, awful short stories about Narnia and a graphic novel that I wouldn't even recommend anybody see, just from my perspective. He thinks that there's a problem with Susan because, and there are a lot of people who say that because Susan at the very end is not entering Narnia because she's interested in nylons and boys and lipstick, that's misogyny on the part of Lewis. I don't think it is. I think it's instead Lewis communicating, unless you become as a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. But that's Gaiman's view. But nonetheless, he can't get away from Narnia. He says it exactly as Lewis said it would. It kind of went past those watchful dragons that were protecting him from talking about or hearing about these things, and it captured his imagination and still does. So Gaiman is not like Philip Pullman, for instance. His Dark Materials series is kind of the anti-Lewis and gives you this bleak, atheistic view of the universe, kind of countering. That's not what Gaiman does. So he's not a believer, but he's, look at his book, American Gods, where he's got this reality of that he's presenting of the old gods, kind of the old standard pagan deities, and the new gods of media and technology and money. But what all of them alike are drawing is worship. So they're needing worship. So there's this understanding of idolatry. There's even themes in here of self-sacrifice of a dying God on a world tree who is resurrected. I mean, all sorts of things that you might read through this and say, well, maybe you have a hidden agenda, maybe that you're not even aware of yourself. And he also does, if you think about Lewis was criticized by Tolkien because Tolkien created this whole sub-creation mythology with Middle-earth, and he saw Narnia as a wreck because you had all of these different sorts of genres, right down to Father Christmas, showing up in the same place. But Lewis was intentionally doing that. American Gods does this too. I mean, you have Odin, and you have a personification of technology, and you have Lucy from I Love Lucy. All of these things showing up here intentionally in creating this sense of gods and idolatry going across the spectrum. Which, if you look at it from a Acts 17, Paul at Athens sort of perspective, what you would say is there's a recognition here of that draw toward worship and that draw toward idolatry and the disappointment that comes with idolatry. Same thing, he's got a really good collection on Norse mythology. And you remember how important for Lewis and Tolkien, Norse themes and that sense of, as Lewis called it, northernness was in terms of capturing their imaginations. Gaiman too. And even though he's not a believer, he talks about Ragnarok, that twilight of the gods, and says for him, that's an attractive view because it gives a narrative to history, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what I would say is, I think that there's a longing on his part and on all of our parts for that kind of plot line. And I would just argue Jesus is the plot line that makes sense of everything Ephesians 1:10. If I had to say, here's one book by Neil Gaiman that I think you should read, it would be this one, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. I think it is beautifully written. It is something somebody who is maybe teenagers and up could appreciate this book. And it's just beautifully written. There are all sorts of parts in this book that I would stop and just think about for a while. And it's a good story, a really good story. So I happened to notice on Instagram, Neil Gaiman posted where he was working, said he was in his hobbit hole. Tolkien is still there anyway, in his life. And he showed a picture of this room. And so I was encouraged by that. And so that means he's still writing. And so I look forward to seeing what he has to write next. And boy, wouldn't it be great if one day, despite everything, Neil Gaiman were to actually find his way to the real and greater Narnia. We can hope and pray. This is Russell Moore, and this is Reading in Exile. If you have something you'd like for us to talk about on here, let me know in the comments.